Hi everybody, and welcome to the shed, where basically we just play around with stuff. This is a compound gearbox that we made in video 2009, and inside of there are stacked planetary gear systems. Now a planetary gear system looks like this. It's essentially three elements arranged like this: sun, planets and ring. The large central gear is the sun gear, and it's surrounded by smaller gears called the planet gears, and themselves are surrounded by a much larger gear that's in the shape of the ring, and it's called the ring gear. The planet gears are all held together by a carrier called the planet carrier. The way it works is you hold one section stationary and move the other two in relation to each other. So here we're holding the sun gear stationary, and the planet gear is being turned to turn the external ring gear. We can equally hold the ring gear stationary and rotate the sun, which rotates the planets, and the output is through the planet carrier. Or we can hold the planets still and move the ring in relation to the sun. So this gives us a very compact unit with an easy to select set of ratios, which is why you see them used in transmissions all the time. You'll also see them used in drills, for example, as well as many other places. And the way you work out the gear ratios is just like any other gear. It's the ratio of the teeth. So the ratio of the sun gear to the ring gear teeth gives you that gear ratio. If you want to know the ratio of the planets, what you do is add the sun and the ring together, and that's called the effective teeth of the planet carrier, and they again would just be the ratios of the teeth. Now because of that, of course, if you have an output gear where you're using the sun and the planets, that's always going to be the highest gear, which is why you see that in things like drills. They're fixed, and the common thing to do is hold one part still and move the other two parts. But it does beg the question, what about if you moved all three parts in relation to each other? So what I've done is I've taken the ring gear, and instead of just having the ring teeth on the inside, I've also added them on the outside, and that will allow us to drive the ring independently of the other gears, so we can rotate all three at the same time. And what that'll mean is that we'll have two input gears and one output gear, so the input will be the sum of the two input gears, and we should be able to dramatically alter that gear ratio. So what I've done is I prepared this in Tinkercad, which is a whole other gear set. So we've got our sun and planet gears right here. There's the planet with the planet carriers. That actually is the output, so it'll go on to there like that to create my output drive. The input drive of the sun is this one, which will go in the center like that to create a sun and planet arrangement. And then of course we put our ring gear onto the outside like that, and we have our planet gear system, but we're able to drive it from the external as well. So let's put that together. And to put that together, what we need to do is put some bearings in there. They're skater bearings. So they're 22mm by 7mm by 8mm. And in the sun, we've got an 8mm hole. So we put a bar in there that juts out just big enough to go into there, so it makes one unit. And of course we want that to spin freely, because the spinning of this needs to be independent of that, and so we put a washer between them. Let's do that. So there it is with its bearings. We've got the bar in there, we pop a washer on there, that then fits in there, and so the sun can now turn independently of the planet carrier. The planet carrier's here, we put the planet gears on, and then that fits, says he, there we go, that fits on there. Like that, and the sun goes in there. There we go. And then we put the ring on. And there it is in its cradle. Now it operates just like any planet gear. So if I turn the sun and hold the ring, the output is on the planets, which is right there, and you can see it turning slowly but with lots of torque. Equally, if I hold the planets and turn the sun, the ring gear will turn. Or if I hold the sun and turn the ring gear, again the planets will turn. So it operates just like any other planetary gearbox. But something really interesting happens if I rotate this at the same time that I rotate the sun. To look at that, I've printed this, which is a drive gear. If I put it in this other cradle here, then we can intermesh the drive gear with the ring gear by lining them up like that. Okay, so I just butted these up against each other. Now if I hold that gear and turn this, then we can see that that gear is not turning, and so it's operating like a planetary gear. But if I keep turning that at a constant rate, and I'm turning this clockwise, and I turn that gear, this gear, anti-clockwise, you can see that we slow down the flag. And the rate at which we slow down the flag is equal to the rate at which this spins. And so what we've got is an infinitely variable transmission. Now if I rotate it clockwise and rotate that clockwise, what we get is an increase in speed, and so we've got an extra gear that we can control externally. Now if we attach a motor to that gear and change the speed of the motor with a variable resistor, we can use that changing the speed to control the output of the planetary gear system. What we've got now is an electronically controlled, continuously variable transmission. If we speed that up far enough, we can even put this into reverse. Now I saw that, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's obvious that it can be used in a car as a CVT, but if we use that in a wind turbine, there must be huge benefits to be had, because of course the wind turbine inputs in the sun. The output to the generator is here on the planets, and as the wind blows more strongly, of course, everything turns that much more quickly, and that's when you get a danger of blowing up your generator. But if we had a system where we could slow down the output, even though the input was increasing, of course what we'd get is a much broader range of wind speeds in which we could operate our wind turbine, and that would mean they would generate more energy per wind turbine, and I thought that was super cool. Now of course we're taking sense data of wind speed and controlling it electronically by changing the motor's speed, and I thought that would work really well. But would it be possible to connect the input to this as a feedback mechanism that would control itself? So I went and made an idle gear. These three bits are for an idle gear. All we do is print them off, pop that in there and put that on there, a bit of glue, and we have an idle gear. So there's my idle gear in place right there. Now the gear teeth are all the same, so this is 50 teeth, 50 teeth, 50 teeth. So all that gear does is make sure that that turns in the opposite direction to that. And of course we need that in order to slow it down, because if we turned it in the same direction, then the two would add together and speed it up. And incidentally, in the file I've printed this, so if you put that onto the sun gear here, that will engage with that drive gear, and what you'll get is double the speed out of here. But I'm interested in wind turbines, so I've put my idle gear in there. So if I turn this clockwise, this will turn anti-clockwise, making that turn clockwise, which is exactly what we want. So now we need to see if it'll actually work. So if I spin that slowly, you'll see the flag going round. If I spin it quickly, more or less the output stays the same. Of course, I just guessed at these gear ratios. You'd need to do a bit more optimization to get the correct gear ratio, but it seems that that actually works really well, that this forms a feedback mechanism. So the faster the blades spin, it spins this faster, which spins this, creating a mechanism that slows down the output, so the output remains relatively constant. I thought that was brilliant, which is why I didn't put it together with the motor demonstration. I wanted to put it together with the idler in place demonstration, so you can see that the increasing the speed of the wind turbine blades does not increase the speed significantly of the output. And of course the effect of that is that the wind turbine is going to be able to operate in a much broader range of wind speeds without putting the generator into peril. So anyway, I thought I would share that with you. Of course, all of these files are on Thingiverse, should you want them. And if you want to play around with those gear ratios, then please feel free and keep me in touch with what you're doing. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to like and subscribe. No, if you don't like that, stick a motor on there. So a German architect has invented a new kind of solar cell, but unlike other solar cells which are flat panels, this one is an enormous ball of glass, and the claim is the special optical properties, the geometry, allow this to be 57% efficient, which of course is far more than you would expect a normal solar cell to be. So the big glass ball acts like a ball lens, focusing the light onto a small photovoltaic panel. Because the panel's so small, it's relatively easy to move, and so there's a dual axis tracking system. They're also looking at collecting the thermal energy by combining it with the Stirling engine to create a hybrid device. So what it basically is a concentrated photovoltaic system. It's the invention of Andrea Brossel, and it's been developed by a company called Rollerman. The slightly odd claim by the creators is that it can be used to harvest energy from moonlight, albeit at a much reduced efficiency than sunlight. Now, it certainly takes a prize for out-of-the-box thinking, but could it really work? So I have these, and they're little fence lights that are solar cell driven. So there's a solar cell there, you hang them on your fence and they light up at night. And it's quite astounding really, because they've obviously got a little solar cell, a couple of LEDs, they'll have a circuit in there, they'll have a battery and a little tiny charge controller. And all of that for about £2 or so. You buy them in a box of 6 for a tenner. Anyway, let's take it apart and get the bits out. Okay, so there's the solar cell that I've picked off the front, and there's the lithium battery right there, and we've got the on-off switch and then a little circuit board with a couple of LEDs on it. We'll save that because we don't know if we're going to use that later or not, but let's just check that we haven't actually broken this taking it out by connecting it up to a multimeter and covering it over. So if I cover that over, I get nothing, and then if I expose it to the lights in here, actually that's pretty good. That's 1.9 volts even on these lights here, so that's kind of cool. There you go, 1.9 volts. Okay. So courtesy of LED lighting in cars, I have one of these. It's called a bullseye lens. It's hemispherical, and you get them in all headlights these days. And of course I went down to the scrapyard and pulled this out of a headlight. And the question is, will this actually make a difference to our solar cell? So there's our meter reading our solar cell under ambient light conditions. Now let's add our bullseye. And we do get an increase. It's quite small, but we get an increase. And back down. And back up again. So there's no real surprise that that worked. I mean, it's a waveguide, it's a lens, it's collecting the light, bending the light and pointing it in a single direction. So because when the solar cell is sitting out there, it's receiving the light, but any angled light it can't get. It works best if it's straight on. And what this does, of course, is bend all of that light from around here and here and here, and so it's straight on coming out of there. And it is the subject of a lot of research developing light guides to put on top of solar cells, and it's also the inspiration behind the Beta EY by Andrea Brossel, which is a great big sphere of glass. It's a beautiful looking thing, but of course whenever you stick anything on top of a solar cell, even a piece of optical glass, what it's going to do is absorb some of the light, and so the benefit you get from it is relatively modest. I mean, it wasn't that bad. We went up from, what is it, 1.35 to 1.48 volts, so we got a reasonable increase in the voltage in terms of percentage, but we're still losing quite a lot of the energy just by it being absorbed like that. And of course solar cells can only work in a relatively short range of solar power, that amount of light that they can actually use within the correct wavelength. It'd be really great if we had a material that took the light that it absorbed and re-emitted it, but re-emitted it in a light wavelength that the solar cell can use. And of course, the reason I mention this is because such materials do exist, and they're not exotic at all. In fact, there's an example of one. This is a piece of acrylic filled with fluorescent material, and it acts like a light guide. It collects all the light here, bounces it around, absorbs it, and re-emits it in a visible light that we can see along the edge. And that's why the edge of these things are always so much brighter. Now we want to have a look at this as being a waveguide, so what I'm going to do is turn the lights off and we'll see how that works. Okay, I've turned the overhead lights off so we can see this, and there's the reading on the meter, and here are my fluorescent panels, and let's hold them over the solar cell. So here's my meter, here's the solar cell. Let's put our fluorescent panels over and see what happens to the meter. Isn't that cool? So the big problem with these kind of systems is that concentrating light also concentrates the heat, and using something like fluorescence can help alleviate that. Now the Spherical Collector is a concentrated photovoltaic, and it's going to have the same problems that all concentrated photovoltaics have. It is definitely a very sexy design, but it could be a bit more a style over substance really in terms of the advantages they're claiming, because it doesn't matter whether it's a great big ball as a lens, or a sheet of micro lenses, or a sheet of prisms that you put on there, or reflective mirrors that you might use. All of the problems are going to be the same. There's going to be one added problem with concentrating it the way they have done with the spherical system, is that it's very reliant on the lens, and so maintenance is going to be extremely high, basically just cleaning off the bird poop. So although it looks great, and it certainly had a splash when it first came out, I think that the design is good, but the technical details are perhaps a little sketchy. So it's a curious thing that in the domestic situation we use something like 55% of our energy just keeping warm in winter and cool in the summer. That's an awful lot of energy, and it'd be very cool if we could do something about that. And there are 3 researchers from the University of California who've done something that, to be honest, is quite astounding. And to do it, they only use 3 things: super black, super white, and this little bit of washing machine. This is a wax motor, and you find them in things like dishwashers and washing machines operating the soap dispenser or the door lock. Now they're not actually a motor, they're a linear actuator. And they're incredibly simple devices. They're basically a copper cup filled with wax attached to a plunger. When the wax melts, it expands anything between 5 and 20% depending on the type of wax. And the temperature at which it melts and expands also depends on the type of wax. When it melts and expands, it pushes on the rod, and that will actuate something like a door or a catch. It's not incredibly quick, but it is incredibly strong for the size of it, with something this small being capable of pushing against several kilograms. The beauty of them is they don't need any components, as long as they've got a heat source, and that can be the ambient temperature, hot water, or an electronic heater. They will melt and push. And in wet, caustic environments like a dishwasher or washing machine, they're ideal, where an ordinary solenoid would just rot away. This is Vantablack. It's supposed to be the world's blackest black and absorbs 99.965% of all light. That's ultraviolet, visible light, and infrared. It's said to be the nearest thing we can get to looking at a black hole. If you paint something with Vantablack and light on top of a Vantablack flat surface, you can't see the thing that's been painted. You can't make it out until you rotate it round. Of course, there are competing blacks that people have invented that say the same things, but it is incredibly impressive stuff. And the thing about black is the reason it's black is it absorbs light. But all that energy doesn't go anywhere. Once it absorbs that light, it gets hot, and that heat can be used to do things like heat up water. And of course, in the winter, heat up your house. Vantablack is an exceptional material, a super black, and it does a really good job. But any black will do this. Of course, on the opposite side of the coin to the blackest black is the world's whitest white, and Purdue University came out with this radiative cooling paint about 3 years ago that reflects the heat away and back into space. Since Purdue did this, Nighthawk in Light has replicated this with his own recipe, as has Tech Ingredients, as has myself. So a radiative white paint that throws the heat off in the summer is easily accessible and readily available. So taking those three simple but genius ideas, the team from Santa Barbara created a roofing tile that switches between its hot and cold state depending on the temperature. And they released this paper of January of this year detailing everything that they'd done. And this is what they basically did. They used the wax motor to operate a pivot and linkage, and the linkage was a louvre. One side they painted with a black and the other side they painted with a white that would open and close depending on whether it's night or day or hot or cold. And the results they got were indeed dramatic. What they claim is up to 2.5 times less energy being used for heating and cooling when compared with other static devices. The guys from the university created a tile 4 inches by 4 inches, which is 100mm by 100mm. And the plan is to create roof tiles of these things. Now, I'm unsure of how long such a thing will last, but given it's a wax motor, you're talking about a lifespan in the region of decades, which is pretty cool because it's going on a roof. You don't want to be changing that every couple of years. Now, it's exactly the kind of engineering that I love. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's robust, it's practical. It truly is a work of genius. So I thought I would share that with you. Now, when I look at that, I don't see a device that is particularly difficult should anybody choose to experiment with this themselves. So there have been records of vertical axis wind turbines as far back as the 9th century Persia, or even the 7th century BC if you consider the Afghan highlands. And these were really pretty primitive devices. They were drag-based devices where you basically covered up one side and the wind hit it and pushed it round. The far more efficient aerodynamic lift-based VWT was invented by Georges Darius in France as late as the 1920s, and he patented both his egg beater type and a straight-bladed VWT called the H rotor. Now, Darius himself built a number of both curved and straight-bladed small-scale models, but the first power-producing aerodynamic lift-based VWT was constructed by Jean-Baptiste Morel, who in the 1950s built a number of straight-bladed turbines ranging up to 7 kilowatts in southern France. Throughout the 70s and 80s, various utility-scale turbines were built, with the North American continent focusing on the egg beater type and the Europeans focusing on the H rotor type. Unfortunately, in a Darius-type turbine, the blades have a habit of twisting in the wind, and this leads to blade fatigue and subsequent catastrophic failure. The DAF turbine on Prince Edward Island fell to the ground after blade failure in 1985. In 1981, the Alcoa 500 kilowatt turbines located in San Giorgino Pass collapsed after a power outage resulted in rotor overspeeding and the blades breaking loose. They shattered and flew for a distance of 300 meters, with the rest of the turbine falling to the ground. In 1986, the Flowwind 19 had a catastrophic failure that threw a blade right through the measurement trailer. In England, it was a similar story. At Carmarthen Bay in 1986, the 500 kilowatt prototype there experienced several failures linked to the power transmission and ultimately the devastating failure of one of its fiberglass blades. So the VWTs, at utility scale at least, quickly established themselves as being prone to failure, difficult to construct, difficult to maintain, and of low efficiency. Now, you might wonder, given the litany of disaster that surrounds the development of VWTs, why on earth do people keep persisting with them? Well, there's a reason, and the reason is there's a problem with HAWTs. It's a very serious problem, nobody's admitting to it, and they're quietly working on VWTs in the hope of overcoming the problem with HAWTs. The first point is really economic. Until about 2025, the current cost of production per megawatt hour of electricity using wind turbines is $122. By 2040, it's expected to drop to around about $85 per megawatt hour. By comparison, fuel-powered electric generators produce a megawatt hour in the region of $38. What this means is that if the cost of wind energy doesn't drop below $50 per megawatt hour, it's going to fail to become competitive. Right now, all projects are being implemented with government subsidies for the sake of decarbonisation targets. But in the long run, making successful businesses out of them isn't looking particularly good. The second point is really in the nature of the turbine itself. They've really reached the physical limits of the materials that they're being made from, and no further technologies of scale are expected. And to get a sense of that, then if we look at the turbine, it is monolithic. For a 6 megawatt plant, you need something in the region of 700 tons of steel and 5,000 tons of concrete. Every year, the efficiency of a wind turbine installation decreases by an average of 4.5%, which means after 10 years they're producing about half as much energy, and the probability of failure and breakdown also grows. After 8 years, the probability is 80% that something will fail. Because the main working structure is so high up, the cost of maintenance and replacement is very expensive. And what this all adds up to is a desperate search for an alternative before the jig is up. Now with VWTs, they were abandoned quite early, so there's a lot of scope that doesn't exist in HAWTs for advancement of this technology, and of course there's a lot of research going on, but two things have happened recently. One is that research has now moved forward into trial plants, and the second is the discovery that VWTs are far more efficient than we actually thought. So this is the C-Twirl. It was launched as a prototype, the S1, in 2015, and it was a 30 kilowatt prototype to see how it went, and it withstood storms and hurricanes. So now they're launching a 1 megawatt prototype for a 5-year trial, and the expectation is that this will bring it below the magic number of $50 per megawatt hour that will make this a viable thing. To my mind, what it shows is that with better design and engineering, VWTs can compete with HAWTs, and they were just abandoned too early. And they carry with them the benefits of being smaller, cheaper and more robust. Of course, C-Twirl is just one example of the progress of VWTs, and there are many more. The significant thing about C-Twirl is it's perhaps the first one that's gone into a prototype and then onto a test field where it's showing that it can do something that HAWTs just can't, and that is produce electricity that is competitive with current fuels, and that is truly astounding. Now, if you couple that with this, it's a research paper showing what happens when you put 2 or more VWTs together. Now, all wind turbines give off turbulence, but with the HAWT, you have to spread them apart because the turbulence of one will interfere with the production of another. With a VWT, turns out the turbulence supports each of the generators, giving an astounding 15% improvement in efficiency. Now, this is game-changing stuff. It's completely counterintuitive, and of course it's caused a great deal of excitement, and there's a great deal of research going into this, because instead of spreading them out like you have to do with HAWTs, cram them a bit closer together, you get a much denser area of production that's able to extract much more of the wind and give you an improvement in the performance. It's truly astounding. So if you put those two things together, We've got an improvement of engineering and design that is getting below that magical $50 per megawatt hour. We've got a realization that you'll get support of one and the other, and our thought about what the efficiency was of a VWT is wrong if we put them together. Then we start to see a paradigm shift, a real change in how we might approach wind generation from a traditional way that really is kind of getting at the end of its road for development. So, a couple of years ago, it became very popular to turn plastic into fuel, and it's a stupidly easy thing to do. The first thing to do is to find yourself some plastic. These are milk bottles, which means they're HDPE, or high density polyethylene. You can also use plastic bags. Chop them up into small pieces, and there's about 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters square, and when you've chopped them all up, you'll end up with this. What you do then is stick that into a paint can. Then we can pop a lid on that, and the lid's got a piece of copper pipe sticking out of it, which will go to a condenser, which is a coiled bit of copper that will help everything cool down. Then we give it some heat. So you can do this with all kinds of things. Actually, you can do it with tyres as well. But HDPE is particularly good because it leaves no residue. Styrenes work well. Any kind of plastic this will happen with, because the plastic has no water in it to be driven off and no volatiles, so it cooks down to a goo, and then it begins to break up, and then it begins to distill. When you've given it a while, you can take the lid off. When you take the lid off, what you'll find is pretty much nothing. There'll be a little bit of plastic left. And this is what happens with HDPE. Other materials will leave residues, but this is really what you get. The liquid, while still warm, will be a liquid, and we're pouring it into a jar with a wick. However, when it cools down, it'll solidify into a wax. This is more common with HDPE. You see other people making diesel fuels, but actually most plastics create this waxy substance. The wax is a fuel in itself, and if we cut that down to a wick, we can turn this into a candle, and it'll just burn like a candle burns. But that tends to be the product of plastic destructive distillation, which is exactly what we've just done. There you go. It'll burn for ages. I personally think that's pretty cool, but it has received a fair amount of criticism, and that's fair enough, because you're making a fuel from old plastics, but you need to burn quite a lot of wood to make that destructive distillation process progress, so it's using a lot of energy to create it. And of course, if you're less than careful about collecting those gases, you could be chucking some pretty horrible things into the atmosphere, and at the end of the day, all you actually do with this stuff is burn it. And that's, you know, perhaps not the best of things to do with any resource. So, big question. How can we improve that? And is there anything we could do with that waxy product apart from burn it? And the answer to that is yes, of course, or I wouldn't be doing this video. And this paper came out and is receiving a lot of attention this week on the production of a spider-like silk from that waxy substance we got as the product of our distillation. In the paper, they follow pretty much the same procedure that we just did. They get themselves some HDPE, they cut it into small squares, and then they destructively distill it. But instead of doing it directly in a paint can, what they do is use a catalyst. And the catalyst they use is strontium titanium trioxide, and that reduces the temperature needed, and so the amount of fuel that you use in order to distill the HDPE into a waxy product. The next step, the researchers at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute of New York, where this was developed, is to ferment it. The bacteria used is Pseudomonas aeruginosa. That and the wax is put into a flask and left for 72 hours. Essentially, the bacteria use the wax as food and turn it into a silk-like protein. The biological process behind this innovation is something people have employed for millennia. Fermentation is used to make all kinds of things and preserve foods like cheese, bread and wine, beer and penicillin. What's really exciting about this process is that unlike the way plastics are produced today, the process is low energy and doesn't require the use of toxic chemicals. The best chemists in the world could not convert polyethylene into spider silk, but these bacteria can. What they're really doing is harnessing what nature has developed to do manufacturing for us. After 72 hours, you strain off the bacteria, freeze dry it, and what you end up with is a material that looks like torn up cotton balls, and that's ready to spin into a silk thread. You can think of spider silk as nature's Kevlar. It can be nearly as strong as steel under tension. However, it's 6 times less dense than steel, so it's very lightweight. As a bioplastic, it's stretchy, tough, non-toxic, and biodegradable. Spider silk is already woven into fabric called golden silk. It used to be made into body armour and it is bulletproof. So this paper shows that we can use bacteria and fermentation, something we've been doing for millennia, to recycle plastics into a useful product, something more than just pressing it into more plastic or quite simply burning it. And I found that very exciting and interesting. Of course, there's more work to do on it before it's a commercial scale, but that is awesome stuff. War, unfortunately, seems to be something that is in our genes, and throughout history, animals have been integral to warfare, playing a huge number of roles that extend beyond mere companionship. From ancient times to modern conflicts, animals have served militaries worldwide. Horses are renowned for their strength and speed, and they revolutionised cavalry chargers, granting unparalleled mobility and force projection on the battlefields. Dogs, with their acute senses, loyalty and agility, became invaluable as messengers, guards and even detectors of explosives. Pigeons, celebrated for their homing instincts, served as reliable couriers delivering vital messages across enemy lines. Furthermore, elephants were used for their imposing presence and ability to strike fear into adversaries, functioning more like living tanks in ancient warfare. More recently, dolphins and sea lions have been trained for underwater missions, including locating mines and enemy divers. The use of animals in war hasn't been without controversy and has sparked ethical debates regarding their use in dangerous and sometimes lethal roles. And sometimes, of course, those roles were just plain stupid and a failure. Take, for example, the story of the tank dogs. The tank dog was a Russian idea. They trained dogs between 1930 and 1946 to carry explosives towards tanks, and they actually used them from 1941 to 1943 against the Germans. To begin with, the dogs were trained to leave a timer-detonated bomb and retreat, but it quickly changed to an impact detonation procedure which killed the dog in the process. At the time, the Russian army had no dog trainers, so they recruited hunters, policemen and circus trainers to train the dogs, and they favoured German shepherd dogs. Of course, the trainers loved their dogs and the dogs loved their trainers. And the original idea was that the dog would carry the bomb strapped to its body, reach a target, pull on a handle, drop the bomb, run away, and then it could be detonated. Initially it was a success, but if they moved or changed the target, the dog got confused and no dog could actually work the handle that dropped the bomb. So they made it simpler by fastening the bomb onto the dog and detonating it when the dog got to the tank. They were trained by keeping them hungry and putting the food underneath the tank, and of course they used Soviet tanks, so when they actually deployed them, the German tank was very different. It looked different, it smelt different, and it moved differently, and instead of going towards the German tanks, the dogs went to the tanks they knew and rushed towards the Russian tanks. Or back towards the Russian lines. The Russians were forced to shoot them before they did severe damage to the tanks or killed more than a few of the soldiers that they managed to kill. Of course, the trainers were extremely upset by this and refused to train any more dogs. The whole thing was a fiasco and quickly came to an end in 1943, long before the conclusion of the war. The Japanese tried the same idea, but instead of aiming at tanks, they aimed at bunkers, and they called them demolition wolves. But it ran into similar problems. The dogs wouldn't enter the bunker, they would sit there, they wouldn't wouldn't wait for the specified time or they would run back to their handlers, and the whole programme was terminated on 17th December 1943 out of safety concerns, and this wasn't concerns for the dogs. Bat bombs are an American idea dreamt up by Little S. Adams, a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania. The bomb itself was a bomb-shaped casing with 1,000 compartments, each of which had a hibernating Mexican bat in it, to which they strapped a small napalm waistcoat. They dropped the bomb at dawn, and the casing would open and the bats would come out, and then of course they would seek somewhere to shelter for the day. And of course most Japanese towns are made from wood and paper, and the bats would spread in an area of something to 20 to 40 miles radius, and the little incendiaries they were wearing were on timers. The US Navy took control of it in August 1943 and used the codename Project X-Ray. The first test was a disaster. The bats were accidentally released and they roosted under a fuel tank, and when they went off they incinerated the test range. They actually continued development right up until mid-1944, reporting that it was an effective weapon, and by the time they stopped it, it was estimated that $2 million had been spent on it, and that's the equivalent of $32.5 million of today's money. But development was just too slow, and it was overtaken by the atomic bomb, which presumably was much more effective and a better bang for the buck, so to speak. Of course, there have been lots of various military attempts to make animals a delivery system for bombs. It goes right back to the Song dynasty in China, who tried using oxen, and other attempts have been made using so-called kamikaze dolphins. The big problem there being that the dolphins just swam away. But numerous documents of animal-borne bomb attacks exist in which donkeys, mules, horses were all used or attempted to use to deliver bombs. Pig bombs and monkey bombs, although they sound ludicrous, were in fact real, if not horrific, things. You would soak the animal in pitch, set it alight and let it run free, hoping it would cause as much damage as possible. The suffering must have been horrendous. Project Pigeon, later renamed to Project Orcon, was an American attempt to develop a pigeon-controlled guided bomb. The pigeon would sit in front of the bomb in the nose cone with 3 windows that it would peck at. When it saw a ship in the window, it would peck at that window and the bomb would be guided in that direction. The whole project was dreamed up by B.F. Skinner of operant conditioning fame. That is, you dropped a food reward for behaviour you wanted to reinforce. The problem was that the National Defence Research Committee saw the idea of using pigeons to guide bombs as very eccentric and impractical, but it still contributed $25,000 to the research. Then Skinner, who had the success with training, complained, "Our problem is no one would take us seriously," and the programme was cancelled on the 8th of October 1944. But pigeons have an incredible field of view and eyesight, something like 200 times better than human eyes, and it was resurrected in the 70s, and in February 1979 the US Coast Guard helicopter took off with a cage strapped underneath it containing pigeons so they could spot orange debris on the sea and guide the pilots in that direction. Again, it was a huge success, but seen as extremely quirky, and night vision goggles soon came in to replace it, though there was a suggestion of replacing the pigeons with owls for nighttime vision. Despite the ethical dilemmas in using animals in warfare, there are severe practical limitations. Their unpredictability, vulnerability, and inability to grasp complex commands makes them, well, one might describe them as unreliable as assets. Technology offers a more efficient and humane alternative than use of animals, and the use of animals has often been impractical and, one might think, downright silly. Of course, a lot of these ideas were born out of necessity and desperate need, which is often a hallmark of war, but if necessity is the mother of invention, then she's not always the mother of good ideas. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching.